The summer of 1871 brought with it a devastating drought across the plains of Nebraska, turning lush grasslands into kindling that awaited only a spark. In those unforgiving times, when the divide between life and death was measured in a single decision, extraordinary courage emerged from ordinary people. This is the remarkable story of Eleanor Ellie Mitchell, a schoolteacher with a passion for music, and Thomas Swift Arrow, a Lakota scout whose wisdom and compassion transcended the bitter boundaries of a divided land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Separated from her community, facing certain death as flames devoured everything in their path, Ellie's journey would become a testament to human resilience and the profound connections that can form when all hope seems lost. The Nebraska Territory, in 1871, stretched vast and promising before those seeking to build new lives in the expanding nation. The rolling prairies, once the exclusive domain of native peoples and buffalo herds, had transformed over decades as homesteaders established farms, ranches, and small communities along the winding tributaries of the Platte River. In these transitional lands, where the stories of multiple peoples intersected, the seeds of both conflict and unexpected connection were sown daily. Pine Ridge settlement had begun as little more than a collection of homesteads clustered around a reliable water source 10 years earlier. By 1871, it had grown into a proper community with nearly 40 families, a general store, a small church, and as of the previous year, its first schoolhouse. The settlement took pride in this progression toward civilization, marking each new building as evidence of their rightful claim to prosperity in this challenging landscape. That summer, however, nature conspired against human ambition. Rain, which typically fell with modest regularity even in the driest months, became a distant memory. By August, the prairie grasses that surrounded Pine Ridge had turned from green to gold to brittle brown, creaking underfoot like delicate glass ready to shatter. The creek that had first drawn settlers to this location diminished to a sluggish trickle, and the community well became the center of carefully managed rationing. In the small schoolhouse that stood at the eastern edge of the settlement, Eleanor Mitchell gazed out the window at the dusty main street, absently folding the letter she'd received that morning. At 32, Ellie's face retained the softness of youth, though new lines had begun to form at the corners of her eyes, evidence of both laughter and recent grief. Her chestnut hair, typically secured in a practical bun for teaching, hung in the simple braid down her back, and her blue eyes, once bright with enthusiasm, now carried the measured gaze of someone intimately acquainted with loss. 4 months, she whispered to the empty classroom, counting the days since her husband William had been laid to rest. The typhoid that swept through Pine Ridge that spring had taken him swiftly, leaving Ellie alone in a community that had initially welcomed her for her education and musical abilities, but now viewed her with the uncomfortable awareness that accompanies unexpected widowhood. The letter in her hand only confirmed what subtle signals had suggested for weeks. The school board, consisting of Harold Jenkins, the general store owner, Pastor Thomas Whitfield, and Franklin Reynolds, the settlement's self-appointed mayor, had regretfully concluded that the position of schoolteacher would be better filled by a more suitable candidate when classes resumed in September. Mr. George Peterson, a recent arrival with experience teaching in Illinois, would assume her duties. The letter expressed appreciation for her temporary service and suggested she might find more appropriate employment, assisting Mrs. Jenkins at the general store or helping with laundering for the single men of the settlement. The careful phrasing did little to disguise the truth. A widow without children of her own was considered an uncomfortable anomaly, and her education from Boston Teachers College now seemed more liability than asset. William's position as the settlement's only doctor had granted her certain allowances as his wife. Without him, those courtesies were evidently expiring. Ellie placed the letter on her desk, running her fingers over the smooth wood William had carefully treated with beeswax each season. They had come west together 4 years earlier, filled with idealistic notions of bringing education and healthcare to frontier communities. William would heal bodies. Ellie would cultivate minds. Together they would help build something meaningful in this new land. Now half of that dream lay buried in the hard earth of the settlement cemetery, and the other half was being politely but firmly dismantled by those who had once welcomed her. Abilities. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Mayor Reynolds stood at the classroom doorway, his substantial frame blocking much of the afternoon light. His face, perpetually reddened by sun and whiskey, attempted an expression of sympathetic authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, didn't expect to find you here. Thought you'd be packing up your quarters." Ellie straightened, nodding toward the letter on her desk. "I only received this morning's correspondence an hour ago, Mr. Reynolds." Reynolds adjusted his vest over his straining buttons, clearing his throat. "Well, yes. Matter of formality, really. The board met last night. Unanimous decision. Peterson has excellent qualifications, taught at a proper boys' academy back east." His eyes skimmed the classroom, deliberately avoiding hers. "We've arranged for you to board with the widow Hanson until you determine your next steps." The suggestion landed like a stone. Sarah Hanson, at 73, lived in a single-room cabin at the settlement's edge, surviving primarily on her son's periodic support from Omaha and the charity of the church ladies. The arrangement was clearly intended to hasten Ellie's departure. "My husband and I purchased our cabin outright, as you well know," Ellie said, unable to keep a note of steel from entering her voice. "I have no intention of relinquishing my home." Reynolds's expression hardened. "Now, Mrs. Mitchell, let's be practical. A woman alone can't maintain a property of that size. Dr. Mitchell's cabin should go to our new physician when he arrives next month. The settlement paid for much of the construction, with the understanding the settlement contributed lumber that William repaid through 3 years of medical service, often without compensation," Ellie interrupted, a flush rising to her cheeks. "The deed bears our names, both our names. The property is legally mine." Reynolds's face darkened further. "Legal technicalities aside, Mrs. Mitchell, your situation has changed. The Settlement Council is prepared to offer fair compensation. For the cabin, certainly enough to establish yourself elsewhere, perhaps back east, near your family." The suggestion that she simply disappear, returning to a Boston that held no family nor prospects for a woman of her age and circumstance, ignited a slow burning anger that Ellie had suppressed since William's funeral. She gathered her reticule and the leather satchel that held her teaching materials, stepping around the desk to face Reynolds directly. "I will need time to consider the settlement's generous offer," she said, infusing the word generous with unmistakable irony. "In the meantime, I'm sure you'll understand that as I'm still the legal owner of my home, I intend to continue residing there." Reynolds stepped aside as she moved toward the door, though his expression promised this discussion was far from concluded. "The council meets again on Thursday. We'll expect your decision then." Ellie nodded curtly and stepped into the oppressive heat of the August afternoon. The sun hung like a malevolent eye in the cloudless sky, and the air carried the acrid scent of parched earth and desperation. A fine layer of dust settled immediately on her skin and clothing as she made her way down the hard-packed dirt of Pine Ridge's main street. The settlement appeared unusually quiet, with most residents either attempting to manage withering kitchen gardens or staying inside during the worst of the day's heat. Several women gathered at the community well, filling buckets under the watchful eye of Jenkins, who had appointed himself regulator of water rations as the drought intensified. They glanced at Ellie as she passed, their expressions a mixture of pity and discomfort, conversations pausing until she was beyond hearing. By the time she reached her cabin at the settlement's northern edge, Ellie's composure had begun to crack. The small structure that had once represented hope and possibility now stood as a painful reminder of all she had lost. The medicinal herb garden William had meticulously maintained had withered in the drought, much like her place in the community had withered after his death. Inside, the cabin's single main room held the accumulation of their shared life, William's medical books carefully arranged on shelves he had built, her small collection of literature and sheet music, the piano they had somehow transported from St. Louis at considerable expense and effort, the bed they had shared, now neatly made with just one pillow in use. In the corner, William's doctor's bag sat undisturbed since his final illness. She hadn't yet found the strength to sort through its contents. Ellie placed her teaching materials on the table and moved to the water pitcher, pouring a carefully measured amount into a basin to wash the dust from her face and hands. Water had become precious, each drop accounted for, the nearby creek now merely a memory traced in dry earth. The cabin felt suffocating in the late afternoon heat, but Ellie resisted opening the windows further, knowing it would only invite more dust inside. Instead, she settled at the piano, her fingers finding the keys in a familiar pattern. Music had always been her solace, and she had often played for William's patients, especially the children, discovering that melody could ease pain in ways medicine sometimes couldn't. She began with a simple lullaby, one her mother had sung to her as a child. The gentle notes filled the cabin, providing momentary respite from the harsh realities pressing in from all sides. As the final chord faded, Ellie allowed herself a moment of clarity. Pine Ridge was systematically removing her from the life she and William had built, her teaching position gone, her home threatened, her purpose questioned. Yet something in her rebelled against simple acquiescence. She had not survived childhood illness, rigorous education, the arduous journey west, and the devastating loss of her husband, only to be discarded when her presence became inconvenient to others' sensibilities. The settlement council expected her to simply vanish, to relieve them of the uncomfortable reminder that tragedy could befall anyone, that a woman might suddenly find herself alone in this unforgiving territory. Their discomfort was not her responsibility to ease. With newfound determination, Ellie rose from the piano and moved to the trunk that contained her personal papers. The deed to the cabin lay within, along with what remained of their savings, and a sum inadequate for starting anew elsewhere, but sufficient for immediate needs. William had also left detailed records of services rendered to settlement families, many of whom had never paid for his medical care. These represented legitimate debts that could potentially be collected, though doing so would hardly endear her further to the community. 3 sharp knocks at the door interrupted her inventory. Ellie composed herself, smoothing her skirts before opening the door to find Harold Jenkins standing there, his tall frame rigid with official purpose. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began without preamble, "the council has sent me to discuss your water ration." Ellie maintained her position in the doorway, neither inviting him in nor stepping outside. "I've adhered to the rationing schedule, Mr. Jenkins. 1 bucket daily, as allocated." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, given the continuing drought and your changed circumstances, the council has determined that single-person households should receive reduced allocations. Effective immediately, you'll be permitted 1/2 bucket daily." The transparent attempt to make her position untenable sparked outrage that Ellie struggled to contain. "Mr. Jenkins, that amount is insufficient for cooking and basic hygiene, as you well know. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. These are difficult times requiring sacrifice from everyone, Jenkins replied, though his own substantial girth suggested personal sacrifices had been minimal. Perhaps this might factor into your consideration of the council's offer for your property. The blatant manipulation stripped away any pretense of community concern. I see, Ellie said coldly. And would Mr. Peterson also be restricted to half rations when he assumes the teaching position? Or does this policy apply exclusively to widows who've declined to disappear conveniently? Jenkins's face flushed. Mind your tone, Mrs. Mitchell. The council makes decisions based on the greater good of Pine Ridge. Individual preferences must sometimes be subordinated to community needs. How fascinating that community needs so perfectly align with certain individuals' convenience, Ellie observed. I'll adjust to the new rationing, Mr. Jenkins, though I wonder what Dr. Hayward would think of a policy that threatens public hygiene. During a period when we've so recently experienced typhoid, the mention of the visiting doctor who had helped treat the Springs epidemic and pronounced William's death caused Jenkins to hesitate momentarily. Dr. Hayward had been explicit about sanitation requirements before departing for the next settlement. The policy stands, Jenkins finally stated, his tone suggesting the conversation was concluded. Half rations beginning tomorrow. With a curt nod, he turned and strode back toward the settlement center, dust rising with each deliberate step. Ellie closed the door, leaning against it as the magnitude of her situation crystallized with painful clarity. The strategy was evident. Make her daily existence increasingly untenable until departing seemed the only reasonable option. First her livelihood, then her home, now her basic necessities. The unfairness burned, but beneath the anger lay the cold recognition that her options were severely limited. She could capitulate, accepting whatever meager compensation the council offered for the cabin and attempting to reach her distant cousin in Chicago. She could fight, leveraging the legal deed and perhaps appealing to the circuit judge when he visited, though that might not occur before winter. Or she could seek opportunity elsewhere, perhaps in one of the larger settlements along the railroad where her education might still hold value. Each path held significant risks for a woman alone in the Western Territories. The drought only complicated matters further, as travel across the parched landscape without adequate water supplies could prove fatal. That evening, Ellie sat at her small table, a single candle illuminating the careful inventory she'd made of her resources and options. The meager light caught the gold of her wedding band as she twisted it absently, a habit developed in the months since William's death. "What would you advise?" she whispered to the empty room, imagining William's thoughtful expression as he considered complex problems. He had always balanced optimism with practicality, believing in human potential while acknowledging human limitations. Morning brought no easy answers, but did deliver new concerning developments. A haze hung over the settlement, and the air carried an acrid scent that hadn't been present the previous day. Ellie stepped onto her small porch, scanning the horizon with a growing alarm. To the southwest, a smudge of darker grey stained the sky, smoke unmistakably, and not from cooking fires, prairie fire. The words formed in her mind with chilling certainty. The inevitable consequence of months without rain, vast stretches of dried grass, and perhaps a careless spark or lightning strike. Such fires could move with terrifying speed when driven by wind, consuming everything in their path. The settlement had already stirred to anxious activity. Men gathered in the central square, gesturing toward the smoke, while women hurriedly collected children and valuables. Ellie heard fragments of conversation as she approached. 20 miles off, by Jackson's estimation, the wind from the southwest pushing it this way could reach us by nightfall if it doesn't change course. Mayor Reynolds stood atop an overturned crate, attempting to organize the growing crowd. "Everyone remain calm. We have time to prepare. Men will form fire brigades at the settlement's perimeter. Women and children should pack essentials only, 1 bag per person. The wagons will depart for Copper Creek by midday if the threat continues to advance." Copper Creek lay some 15 miles northeast, a slightly larger settlement with better access to the river. Evacuation made sense if the fire's path didn't alter, but the single road connecting the settlements would channel everyone in the same direction, potentially creating dangerous congestion if panic took hold. Ellie moved through the crowd toward Sarah Miller, one of the few women in Pine Ridge who had maintained friendly relations after William's death. Sarah's husband managed the livery, giving her access to information about travel conditions. "Is it as bad as it appears?" Ellie asked quietly when she reached Sarah's side. Sarah's normally cheerful face was drawn with worry. "Thomas rode out at dawn to get a better look. He says it's one of the largest he's seen, stretching for miles. The drought has given it plenty of fuel." She clutched her young daughter's hand tightly. "We're packing now. You should do the same, Ellie." Ellie nodded, though a sudden realization struck her with icy clarity. The evacuation would require transportation, wagons, horses, any available conveyance. As a widow without family connections and recently demoted in community standing, would she be allocated space, or would the settlement's leadership use this crisis as the perfect opportunity to resolve the problem she represented? Her suspicion was confirmed minutes later when she approached Reynolds directly to inquire about evacuation plans. "Space is extremely limited, Mrs. Mitchell," he informed her with barely concealed satisfaction. "Families with children naturally take priority. Perhaps you could share your wagon with—" He paused, feigning consideration. "Ah, but you don't have a wagon since the doctor's buggy was reallocated after his passing. A regrettable oversight." The oversight had occurred when William's medical buggy, purchased with their personal funds, mysteriously disappeared from behind their cabin a week after his funeral. Reynolds had explained it as a necessary redistribution of resources, promising compensation that never materialized. "I see," Ellie replied, maintaining composure despite the blatant exclusion. "And those without personal transportation will attempt to accommodate everyone," Reynolds answered, his tone making it clear that everyone might not include her. "Those with special circumstances may need to make independent arrangements." "Special circumstances," Ellie repeated. "How diplomatically phrased." Reynolds' expression hardened. "This is an emergency situation, Mrs. Mitchell. The council must prioritize those most vulnerable." "Of course," Ellie agreed with forced civility. "I wouldn't want to burden the community's conscience further. I'll make my own arrangements." She turned away before Reynolds could respond, her mind racing through limited options. Sarah might offer space in their wagon, but with 3 small children and likely her elderly mother to transport, adding another adult would be difficult to justify. The Petersons, new to the settlement and not yet fully integrated into its politics, might be approached, but they had arrived with minimal transportation themselves. As she walked rapidly back to her cabin, Ellie's thoughts turned to the one resource the settlement council couldn't easily take from her knowledge of the surrounding landscape. While most residents rarely ventured beyond established roads and nearby fields, she and William had often explored further during his house calls to outlying homesteads. She knew of creek beds, rock formations, and other natural features that might offer protection from an advancing fire. Most significantly, she recalled the abandoned Henderson property 3 miles north, where a deep well remained even after. The family had moved on following last year's poor harvest. The well had been dug exceptionally deep, reaching water even during dry periods. If the fire maintained its current trajectory, that location might offer both water for survival and potential shelter, within the stone-lined well itself if conditions became dire. It wasn't an ideal plan, but as the settlement council had made abundantly clear, ideal options weren't available to women in her position. With renewed determination, Ellie returned to her cabin and began methodical preparations for her own evacuation. The small rucksack William had used for extended house calls would hold essentials: water in 2 canteens, preserved food, matches wrapped in oilcloth, his medical kit, a blanket, and a few irreplaceable personal items. The most difficult decision involved William's books and her music, the heaviest but most precious possessions they had transported west at considerable effort. After painful deliberation, she selected only his journal, containing both medical observations and personal reflections, and a single-bound collection of sheet music that included the lullabies and folk songs she treasured most. As she completed her preparations, the smell of smoke had grown noticeably stronger, and ash particles drifted visibly in the air outside her window. The evacuation had begun in earnest, with wagons and riders already streaming toward the northeastern road. From her vantage point, Ellie could see the clear prioritization: council members' families first, followed by those with business relationships to settlement leadership, with less favored residents left to manage as best they could. Sarah Miller's husband Thomas appeared at her door just as Ellie finished securing her pack. His face was streaked with sweat and ash, his expression grim. "Ellie, Sarah sent me to check on you. The fire's moving faster than we expected. Winds picked up. Do you have somewhere to go?" The genuine concern in his voice touched her. "I've made arrangements," she assured him, the small lie easier than explaining her tentative plan or burdening him with guilt he couldn't reasonably address. "You should rejoin your family," Thomas hesitated. "We could try to make room." "Your wagon is already overloaded," Ellie interrupted gently. "The children and your mother-in-law need that space." "I'll be fine, Thomas. Truly." After extracting a promise that she wouldn't delay her departure, Thomas reluctantly left. Ellie watched through the window as he rejoined the stream of departing vehicles, now moving with increasing urgency as the smoke thickened noticeably on the horizon. When the last wagons had disappeared down the northeastern road, Ellie shouldered her pack and stepped outside. The afternoon sun had taken on an eerie reddish cast through the smoke haze, and distant popping sounds marked the fire's advance across the dry prairie. Rather than following the evacuation route, she turned north, away from both the settlement and the approaching conflagration. Alone on the parched prairie, with smoke smudging the horizon behind her and an uncertain refuge ahead, Eleanor Mitchell walked steadily forward. The community that had once welcomed her skills had made its judgment clear. Now, survival would depend entirely on her own resources, knowledge, and determination. As she navigated across the brittle landscape, Ellie recalled William's favorite quotation from Emerson: "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." Her mind had certainly stretched beyond recognition in recent months, through grief, betrayal, and now the immediate threat of natural disaster. Whatever dimensions it might assume after this ordeal remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: she would never again allow others to determine her value or dictate her purpose. The abandoned Henderson property lay ahead, its well offering potential sanctuary, if she could reach it before the advancing fire claimed the withered landscape between. With each step north, Eleanor Mitchell moved further from the life she had known and closer to an uncertain future that would test every element of her character and resilience. The northern horizon stretched before Eleanor Mitchell like a desolate canvas, bleached and brittle from months without rain. Every step carried her farther from Pine Ridge Settlement and the life she had built with William. The weight of her pack pressed against her shoulders, a physical reminder of how little remained of that shared dream. 3 miles to the Henderson property, under normal circumstances, a manageable walk. But with smoke thickening the air and panic tightening her chest, each mile stretched endlessly. An hour into her journey, Ellie paused on a slight rise to assess her progress and the fire's advance. The sight stole her breath more effectively than her exertion. What had been a distant smudge of smoke when she departed now dominated the southwestern sky, a roiling mass of black and grey, tinged with ominous orange at its base. The wind had indeed strengthened, pushing the conflagration northeast at an alarming pace. "Faster than expected," she murmured, estimating distances with growing concern. The fire would reach Pine Ridge by nightfall, hours earlier than Reynolds had predicted. Those who had delayed evacuation might find themselves trapped. Despite the settlement's treatment of her, Ellie felt a pang of worry for stragglers who might not have heeded the warnings with sufficient urgency. She had no means to sound an alarm. Her only option was to quicken her own pace toward potential safety. The Henderson property should appear after cresting the next significant rise, if her recollection of the landscape proved accurate. Adjusting her pack, Ellie continued north, the crackling sounds of the approaching fire now audible during lulls in the wind. The abandoned homestead materialized like a mirage through waves of heat and smoke. A modest cabin with collapsed roof, a dilapidated barn, listing dangerously to one side, and most crucially, the stone-lined well that had been the property's most significant asset. Ellie approached with mingled relief and trepidation. The well still stood intact, its wooden cover weathered but present. However, the surrounding area offered little protection from flying embers or intense heat should the fire engulf nearby structures. Kneeling beside the well, Ellie removed the cover and peered into its depths. The stone lining extended downward, into shadow, with the faint glint of water visible perhaps 30 feet below. The width was adequate for a person to descend, though not comfortably. Iron rungs embedded in the stonework provided access for maintenance, disappearing into darkness. This would be her sanctuary if the fire came too close. A desperate measure, but potentially effective. Wells often survived prairie fires untouched, their stone linings resistant to flames, and their depths protected from heat and smoke. Whether she could safely descend and remain there until danger passed remained uncertain, but uncertainty had become her constant companion since William's death. For now, Ellie decided to shelter in what remained of the barn, where she could monitor the fire's approach while conserving her strength. The structure's partial collapse actually provided advantage. A clear view southwest through missing walls, while the remaining roof offered shade from the punishing sun. From this vantage point, the advancing prairie fire presented a terrifying spectacle. What had appeared as distant smoke from Pine Ridge now revealed its true nature, a wall of flame stretching across the horizon, consuming everything in its path with indiscriminate hunger. The sound had intensified as well, a continuous roar punctuated by sharp cracks and pops as vegetation exploded in the intense heat. The fire's front line advanced with unnatural speed, driven by strengthening winds and unlimited fuel in the form of drought-stricken grasslands. Occasional whirlwinds of flame spiraled upward, reaching heights that seemed impossible. Against such force, human efforts at containment would prove futile. Only natural barriers, rivers, large rock formations, or previously burned areas could halt its progress. As afternoon surrendered to evening, the western sky transformed into an apocalyptic canvas of orange, red, and black. The regular rhythm of sunset had been usurped by fire's irregular pulsing glow. Ash fell like grey snow around the Henderson property, coating every surface and filling the air with acrid particulates that made breathing increasingly difficult. Ellie tied a dampened handkerchief over her nose and mouth, conserving her water but recognizing that respiratory protection had become essential. The temperature had risen noticeably despite the sun's disappearance, the fire generating its own climate as it approached. Even at this distance, the heat pressed against her skin like an unwelcome touch. Wildlife had begun to appear, fleeing, ahead of the flames. First rabbits and ground squirrels, then larger creatures including deer and coyotes, their natural enmities temporarily suspended by mutual terror. They gave the human figure a wide berth, but shared her chosen direction of escape, instinctively seeking safety to the north. By full nightfall, the decision could no longer be postponed. The fire had advanced to within 2 miles of the Henderson property, close enough that individual flames were visible along its ragged front. The roar had become deafening, drowning all other sounds in its hungry consumption of the landscape. The heat had intensified to unbearable levels, and breathing, even through the dampened cloth, had become painful. The well represented her only chance of survival. Gathering her pack and the remaining supplies, Ellie approached the stone circle, with determination masking her fear. One final glance at the approaching inferno steeled her resolve. She secured her pack to her back as tightly as possible, took a deep breath of the smoke-filled air, and began her descent into darkness. The iron rungs, installed decades earlier when the well was first constructed, held firm despite their age. And exposure. Ellie moved carefully, testing each handhold before committing her weight, counting the rungs as she descended. 10, 15, 20, the air growing marginally cooler and clearer with each downward step. The well's opening above diminished to a circle of hazy orange-grey, framing the ash-filled sky. 30 rungs down, she reached the current water level, significantly lower than it should have been in a normal season, but still present. The final rung stood just 6 inches above the water's surface. Ellie balanced precariously, 1 foot on the lowest rung, the other finding purchase on a small protrusion in the stone wall. Water lapped gently at her boots as she pressed her back against the curved wall, finding a position she could maintain for hours if necessary. Above, the circle of sky continued to brighten as the fire approached the homestead. The roar intensified, vibrating through the stones surrounding her. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of sparks and embers swirling past the opening as the fire began consuming the abandoned structures. The temperature in the well increased despite her depth, though it remained tolerable compared to the inferno above. Ellie settled into her uncomfortable refuge, focusing on controlled breathing to conserve energy and reduce panic. The water below offered protection from the worst heat, though its presence created new concerns. If she lost her precarious footing, she would plunge into the cold depths, not immediately life-threatening given her swimming ability, but potentially disastrous for her supplies and her already limited capacity to maintain body heat once the fire passed. Time lost meaning in the well's confines. What might have been minutes stretched to match the distortion of her senses, the overwhelming noise above, the acrid smell of smoke filtering down, the contrast between heated air near her face and cold water at her feet. Ellie found herself humming softly, the melody of her childhood lullaby, emerging unconsciously as a mechanism for maintaining calm amidst chaos. Hush now, quiet now, rest your weary soul. The words followed naturally, barely audible above the fire's roar, yet providing rhythm for measured breathing. William had often commented on how this particular lullaby seemed to calm even the most distressed patients. The memory of his smile as she sang beside sickbeds brought unexpected comfort in her stone prison. The fire reached its peak intensity directly overhead sometime during the night. The well's opening transformed into a furnace-like circle of writhing flame as the remaining structures of the Henderson property surrendered to consumption. Heat pressed downward with suffocating force, driving Ellie to slide lower until water reached her knees. She covered her head with the dampened cloth, breathing through it in shallow gasps as the oxygen thinned. Sleep became impossible, yet consciousness wavered as smoke and limited air took their toll. Ellie fought to remain alert, knowing that relaxing her vigilance could result in losing her footing. She recited poetry, mathematical equations, the names of her Boston classmates, anything to keep her mind engaged as the interminable night continued. The first sign of the fire's passing came as a reduction in the roaring overhead, the continuous thunder gradually separating into distinct sounds of collapsing timber and occasional explosions as pockets of material reached combustion points. The circle above remained orange-red, but the active flames had moved on, leaving behind smoldering devastation. Ellie maintained her position, understanding that emerging too soon could prove fatal. Prairie fires often created unpredictable patterns, with secondary ignitions occurring hours after the main front passed. The ground would remain dangerously hot, and air quality at the surface would be hazardous for some time. As the night progressed toward dawn, exhaustion finally overcame her. Determination. Ellie's consciousness faded in and out, her body somehow maintaining its precarious position, even as her mind surrendered temporarily to darkness. During one such period of semi-consciousness, a hallucination formed, William's voice calling her name from above, telling her to hold on just a little longer. The comforting fantasy sustained her through the darkest hours before morning. The first hint of true dawn appeared as a subtle lightening of the smoke-filled circle above, different from the fire's artificial illumination. Ash continued to drift down into the well, but the oppressive heat had diminished significantly. Ellie's entire body ached from maintaining her awkward position, muscles trembling with fatigue and strain. Cautiously, she attempted to shift her weight, seeking minimal relief without risking her footing. The small movement proved catastrophic. Her boot, damp from hours of partial immersion, slipped from its tenuous position on the stone protrusion. In the instant of recognition, Ellie grasped desperately for the lowest rung, but her numbed fingers failed to maintain their grip. She plunged into the well's cold depths with a startled cry, the shock of immersion driving air from her lungs. The weight of her pack pulled her downward before her instincts activated. Kicking off her boots and struggling free of the pack's straps, Ellie fought her way back to the surface, gasping as her head cleared the water. The well's diameter provided just enough space to tread water, though her sodden clothing dragged heavily against her movements. The lowest rung now stood tantalizingly out of reach, perhaps 18 inches above the water's surface. Without it, she had no means to exit the well. Her sanctuary had become a prison. "Help!" she called upward, knowing the effort was futile. The Henderson property had been abandoned for nearly a year, and the fire would have driven any nearby wildlife far from the area. The likelihood of anyone passing within hearing distance was virtually non-existent, particularly with the settlement. Evacuated in the opposite direction, the irony struck her with brutal clarity. She had survived the fire only to face a slower death by exhaustion or exposure. The water that had protected her from the flames would now hasten her end, its cold embrace steadily drawing warmth from her body. William had lectured often about hypothermia, describing how the body's core temperature dropped in cold water, leading first to confusion, then unconsciousness, and finally cardiac arrest. Ellie forced herself to think practically despite growing panic. The stone walls provided no footholds that she could identify. The pack containing her supplies now rested at the bottom of the well, irretrievable. Her only assets remained her clothing, her determination, and her wits, the last of these increasingly compromised by cold and exhaustion. She established a rotation, swimming vigorously for several minutes to generate warmth, then floating, as still as possible to rest. Between cycles, she called for help, her voice growing hoarser with each attempt. The sun climbed higher, its position visible only as a brighter spot in the hazy circle above. Hours passed in this manner, each minute drawing more of her dwindling strength. By midday, Ellie's condition had deteriorated significantly. Her limbs moved sluggishly, responding with increasing delay to her mental commands. Violent shivering had given way to an artificial sense of warmth that she recognized as dangerous. Most alarming, her thoughts had begun to fragment, focus slipping away like water through cupped hands. "William," she called weakly, momentarily confused about her circumstances. "The patients are waiting." The brief hallucination cleared, leaving her with renewed awareness of her dire situation. Death, which had stalked her in the form of fire, now approached wearing a different aspect. Cold, wet, and infinitely patient, the unfairness cut deeper than fear. To have survived widowhood, community rejection, and a catastrophic prairie fire, only to perish alone in an abandoned well, seemed a particularly cruel conclusion. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ellie's resistance weakened further. Her swimming intervals had shortened to mere moments of movement, while periods of floating extended dangerously. Twice she had drifted beneath the surface, returning to consciousness with choked gasps and renewed panic. Each recovery proved weaker than the last. The third time she slipped under, the darkness seemed almost welcoming. The struggle had lasted so long, and rest beckoned with irresistible appeal. As water closed over her face, Ellie's mind presented a final vivid image. Not William, as she might have expected, but the simple classroom in Pine Ridge, sunlight streaming through windows, while children's voices recited poetry in unison. The vision of what she had loved most about her life accompanied her descent into unconsciousness. A sudden disturbance in the water, hands gripping her shoulders, pulling upward with unexpected strength. Ellie's mind registered these sensations as impossible, the hallucinations of a dying brain creating comfort in final moments. Yet the hands felt remarkably solid, the surface of the water breaking across her face with convincing coldness, air filling her lungs with painful reality. "Breathe," a voice commanded, deep, unfamiliar, and undeniably real. "Breathe now." Ellie's eyes opened to blurred vision, water streaming from her hair and face. Strong arms supported her, preventing her immediate submersion again. As her sight cleared, she found herself looking into the face of a stranger, a Native American man with concerned eyes and a determined expression. A rope secured around his waist extended upward to the well's opening. "Hold to me," he instructed, his English clear though accented. "Can you hold?" Ellie managed a weak nod, wrapping her arms around his neck as he signaled with a sharp tug on the rope. They began rising slowly, his powerful strokes against the wall providing additional leverage, as someone above hauled on the rope. The ascent seemed to take ages, though in reality only minutes passed before they reached the surface. Hands reached down, multiple helpers lifting Ellie from the well into the harsh light of late afternoon. The brightness overwhelmed her dark-adjusted eyes, details blurring as she was laid carefully on what felt like a blanket spread over ash-covered ground. Voices spoke around her, some in English, others in a language she didn't recognize. "The woman is alive but very cold," the man who had rescued her reported. "She has been in water many hours." "Build the fire higher," another voice directed. "Bring the dry clothes from the pack." Ellie struggled to focus, to understand how rescue had materialized in this desolate, fire-ravaged landscape where no help should logically exist. As her vision stabilized, she made out the figures of 5 men, her rescuer and 4 others, all clearly Native American, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and items of European origin. A small campfire burned nearby, impossibly bright against the blackened ground surrounding the Henderson property. "You're safe now," her rescuer told her, kneeling beside the blanket. "I am Thomas Swift Arrow, scout for Major Henderson's unit. These are my companions." He gestured to the others, who continued preparing what appeared to be a small camp around the fire. We were tracking the fire's path when we heard singing from the well." "Singing?" Ellie questioned weakly, her voice barely functioning. Thomas nodded. "A lullaby. My grandmother sang the same to me as a child, though with different words." A slight smile softened his serious expression. "I thought perhaps I imagined it, but insisted we investigate. Fire often plays tricks on the mind." Ellie had no memory of singing after falling into the water. Had she unconsciously returned to the lullaby as her mind began failing? The coincidence that her childhood song would be recognized by a passing Lakota scout seemed beyond possibility, yet here she lay, rescued from certain death by that very connection. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," she managed, feeling obligated to provide some identity in return for salvation. "I was from Pine Ridge Settlement." "Was?" Thomas questioned, astutely noting her choice of past tense. "The settlement survived." Another man interjected, approaching with a cup of something steaming. "The fire turned northeast before reaching the main buildings. We passed it earlier today." The news should have provided relief, yet Ellie felt only hollow acknowledgement. Pine Ridge had made its judgment of her value clear before the fire. Its survival changed nothing about her circumstances or the community's willingness to abandon her when a crisis threatened. "Drink," Thomas instructed, holding the cup to her lips. "Medicine tea, it will help with the cold inside you." The liquid tasted of unfamiliar herbs, bitter yet not unpleasant. Warmth spread from her center outward. As she sipped, whether from the tea's temperature or some property of its ingredients, she couldn't determine. A second blanket appeared, laid carefully over her shivering form. "Rest now," Thomas told her. "When you are stronger, we will determine where you should go. The fire moves on, but leaves much destruction in its path. Many will need help in the coming days." As consciousness began fading again, this time into healing sleep rather than deadly unconsciousness, Ellie found herself wondering at the strange turns fate had delivered. Rejected by her own community and nearly claimed by two different deaths, she now owed her life to strangers from a culture, white settlers, like those in Pine Ridge, actively worked to displace and diminish. The irony would require examination when her strength returned. For now, the simple fact of survival demanded all her remaining energy. As she drifted toward sleep, the last image registered was Thomas Swift Arrow, arranging protective cover to shield her from ash still drifting through the smoky air. A small kindness that represented the first genuine human care she had experienced since William's death. The fire had destroyed everything she possessed except her life itself. What would emerge from these ashes remained uncertain, but Eleanor Mitchell had survived the unsurvivable. Whatever came next, she would face it with newly tempered resilience and the humbling knowledge that connection could form across boundaries she had never thought to question before tragedy stripped away all preconceptions. Eleanor Mitchell drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the night, her body struggling to recover from the combined trauma of smoke inhalation, prolonged immersion in cold water, and extreme exhaustion. Each time she surfaced to awareness, the same sight greeted her: a star-filled sky partially obscured by lingering smoke, the silhouette of a man sitting vigilant nearby, and the gentle crackling of a carefully maintained fire. By dawn, her mind had cleared enough to properly assess her situation. She lay wrapped in blankets beside a small campfire positioned in what remained of the Henderson barn. The structure's partial walls provided minimal shelter while allowing smoke to escape through the missing roof. Her wet clothing had been replaced with an oversized shirt and trousers that she recognized as men's attire, though modesty had been preserved by whoever had performed this necessary task. Ellie pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing as every muscle protested the movement. Her throat felt raw from smoke and coughing, and her lungs burned with each breath. Nevertheless, She had survived when all logic suggested she should not have. "You wake early," observed a now familiar voice. Thomas Swift Arrow moved into her field of vision, carrying a steaming cup. "Most who survive drowning sleep longer." "I wasn't drowning," Ellie responded automatically, then paused, recognizing the technical inaccuracy. "That is, I was, but it wasn't my primary concern at the time." A hint of amusement crossed Thomas's face. "An unusual perspective. Most people consider drowning their primary concern when it occurs." He offered the cup. "More medicine tea. It will help your breathing." Ellie accepted gratefully, noting the tremor in her hands as she raised the cup to her lips. The tea tasted as bitter as she remembered, but its warmth brought immediate comfort. "Thank you," she said after several sips had soothed her throat. "For the tea and for—" She gestured vaguely, the inadequacy of words striking her. "For everything else," Thomas nodded once, accepting her gratitude without diminishing the significance of what had occurred. His economy of expression reminded Ellie of certain New England fishermen she had known in her youth, men who communicated more through silence and deliberate action than through excessive words. Taking the opportunity to properly observe her, rescuer in full daylight, Ellie noted details that had escaped her in yesterday's crisis. Thomas Swift Arrow appeared to be in his early 30s, with the lean, muscular build of someone accustomed to physical demands. His black hair was cut shorter than traditional Lakota styles she had seen in illustrations, and his clothing represented a practical blend of native and European elements. Buckskin leggings and moccasins paired with a calico shirt, partially covered by a military-style vest. Most striking were his eyes, dark, observant, and conveying an intelligence that assessed continuously without revealing his conclusions. Those eyes studied her now with similar evaluation, though without the discomfort such scrutiny might normally provoke. "Your companions?" Ellie asked, noticing they were alone in the makeshift camp. "Continued northwest at first light," Thomas replied. "They rejoined Major Henderson's unit, reporting on fire damage to settlements in this region." He added wood to the fire with practiced efficiency. "I remain until you are strong enough to travel." The statement, delivered matter-of-factly, contained implications Ellie had been too overwhelmed to consider previously. Travel where? Pine Ridge had made her unwelcome before the fire, and its likely survival didn't change that fundamental reality. Her teaching position had been eliminated, her home all but confiscated, and her standing in the community deliberately undermined. Even if physically possible, returning there held little appeal. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to delay your duties. I'm sure I can manage once I've rested further." Thomas regarded her steadily. "The nearest settlement untouched by fire is Rivers Ford, 20 miles northeast. Beyond that, Fort Laramie, 60 miles west." He gestured to the blackened landscape, visible through the barn's missing wall. "No water, no shelter, and scavengers will return to firegrounds soon, seeking easy meals among animals that did not escape." The blunt assessment silenced any further protest Ellie might have offered. Her rescue from the well would prove meaningless if she simply died of exposure or dehydration on the open prairie, whatever discomfort she felt at depending on a stranger, particularly one from a culture white settlers generally regarded with suspicion. Practical reality demanded acknowledgement. "I understand," she conceded. "Where do you suggest we go?" "Rivers Ford," Thomas answered without hesitation. "Small trading settlement, mixed population, less—" He paused, searching for the appropriate word. "Rigid than places like your Pine Ridge." The choice of descriptor surprised Ellie with its diplomatic precision. Rigid perfectly captured Pine Ridge's adherence to social hierarchies and conventional expectations without explicitly condemning the settlement's treatment of her. It suggested Thomas understood more about her circumstances than she had shared. "You said Pine Ridge survived the fire?" she asked, testing the extent of his knowledge. Thomas nodded. "Main buildings untouched. Fire turned northeast before reaching the settlement center. Some outlying structures were lost." His expression remained neutral. "They did not send search parties for missing residents." The observation landed with a quiet weight, not even the pretense of concern for those who might have been left behind. Ellie wondered briefly if her absence had even been noticed amid the evacuation chaos, or if Reynolds and the council had simply considered it a convenient resolution to their problem. "I lived at the settlement's northern edge," she explained, though Thomas hadn't asked directly. "My evacuation options were limited." "Some valleys are worth leaving, no matter how familiar," Thomas responded, the simple statement carrying unexpectedly profound meaning. Before Ellie could inquire further, he continued with practical matters. "We rest today. You recover strength. Tomorrow at dawn, we travel to River's Ford." The day passed in relative quiet, interrupted only by Thomas's periodic departures to scout the surrounding area and check what appeared to be snares he had set some time earlier. These efforts produced a small rabbit for their midday meal, which he prepared with efficient skill over their fire. As Ellie's strength gradually returned, she found herself intrigued by her companion's methodical approach to survival tasks. Each action served a clear purpose, with no wasted motion or unnecessary embellishment. When he spoke, which was infrequently, his words carried similar efficiency, direct and unadorned, yet often containing layers of meaning that revealed an observant mind. By late afternoon, she felt stable enough to assist with small camp tasks. Despite Thomas's initial reluctance to allow her exertion, the activity provided welcome distraction from the uncertainty of her situation and the lingering discomfort of her ordeal. It also offered an opportunity for conversation without the awkwardness of direct questioning. "You mentioned being a scout for Major Henderson," she ventured while helping to prepare another medicinal tea using herbs Thomas had located among the charred landscape. "Are you with the army regularly?" Thomas added carefully measured plant material to the boiling water before answering. "Sometimes when paths align." He seemed to consider how much to explain, then elaborated slightly. "Army needs those who know the land. I know the land." "And your people approve of this arrangement?" Ellie asked, immediately concerned she had overstepped. If the question offended, Thomas showed no sign. "My mother's people are Lakota. My father was a French trader." He stirred the tea methodically. "I walk between worlds, not fully welcome in either, useful to both." The revelation explained much about his appearance, language facility, and comfort with elements of both cultures. It also suggested experience with precisely the kind of societal boundaries that had defined Ellie's recent treatment in Pine Ridge, though in his case vastly more complex and consequential than a widow's non-conformity. "That must be difficult," she observed, thinking of the rigid separations maintained between settlers and native populations throughout the territories. Thomas removed the tea from the fire to steep. "Difficult, yes. Also valuable. I see with different eyes than those who know only one path." He glanced at her with unexpected directness. "As do you, perhaps." The assessment caught Ellie off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Your settlement abandoned you," he stated without accusation, "yet you speak of them without hatred. You understand both justice and mercy." He poured the finished tea into cups fashioned from hollowed gourds. "Rare quality in any people." Ellie accepted the offered cup, considering his observation. "I'm not certain I've achieved such enlightenment," she admitted. "I felt considerable anger before the fire came." "Anger is natural when trust breaks," Thomas replied. "What matters is what grows after the burning." The metaphor, particularly apt given their fire-ravaged surroundings, resonated deeply. Prairie. Fires, while devastating, ultimately renewed the landscape, clearing dead material and allowing new growth to emerge stronger. Perhaps personal devastation followed similar patterns if one survived the initial destruction. As evening approached, Thomas prepared the camp for night, creating more substantial bedding from salvaged materials and positioning their sleeping places to optimize both warmth from the fire and security from potential threats. Throughout these preparations, Ellie noticed his occasional glances toward the northwest, suggesting concerns beyond their immediate circumstances. "You're worried about something," she observed, as they finished a simple supper of trail bread and dried meat from his supplies. Thomas considered her statement before responding, his characteristic thoughtfulness now tinged with what appeared to be internal debate about how much to share. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Fire changes many things," he began, gazing into the flames. "Not just land, people too." He paused again, organizing his thoughts. Settlers lose homes, seek someone to blame. Army increases patrols, watches for Lakota hunting bands near settlements. Tensions rise like smoke. The implications clarified gradually. "You think the fire will worsen relations between settlers and your people," Ellie summarized. Thomas nodded once. "Already troubled waters become more dangerous after a storm." He met her gaze directly. "Tomorrow we will travel to River's Ford. There may be those who question why Lakota Scout travels with white woman. Some questions carry danger. The warning was delivered without drama, but with unmistakable seriousness." Ellie had understood her physical vulnerability since the moment she plunged into the well, but had not considered the potential social and political complications her rescue might create. Thomas had saved her life at considerable personal risk. Not just the physical danger of entering the well, but the subsequent risk of being associated with her in territories where cultural tensions simmered near boiling. "Should we separate?" she asked, placing his safety above her own immediate concerns. "I could wait until other travelers pass." Thomas shook his head decisively. "No travelers on the burned prairie for many days. Waiting means death." His expression softened slightly. "Besides, grandmother's lullaby brought us together. Such connections should not be broken by fear." The reference to the lullaby reminded Ellie of the extraordinary coincidence that had led to her rescue. "You mentioned your grandmother sang the same melody," she said. "How is that possible? Our backgrounds could hardly be more different." "Music travels between peoples like water between streams," Thomas replied, the poetic quality of his response contrasting with his usual pragmatism. "My grandmother learned from a missionary woman who lived among Lakota for many years. She changed words to our language, but kept the tune that reminded her of childhood." The explanation suggested connections between cultures that persisted despite the artificial boundaries imposed by politics and prejudice. Songs, stories, and knowledge continued their exchange through individual relationships that defied larger societal separations, like the unlikely connection that had formed between a widowed schoolteacher and a mixed-heritage scout in the aftermath of disaster. Night descended fully, the darkness more complete due to the absence of settlement lights or even animal sounds in the fire-ravaged landscape. Above, stars emerged with unusual clarity, the smoke having dissipated enough to reveal constellations in brilliant detail. Ellie found herself studying them with renewed appreciation for their constancy amid terrestrial chaos. "The stars guided me often," Thomas commented, noting her upward gaze. "When everything changes below, they remain fixed above." "My husband used to say something similar," Ellie responded, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "He called them nature's compass for troubled times." Thomas nodded appreciation for the phrase. "Wise man. Was he teacher like you? A doctor, Ellie answered, finding she could speak of William without the sharp pain that had previously accompanied any mention of him. He believed education and medicine were twin necessities for frontier communities. We came west together to provide both. His spirit must be strong, Thomas observed. To survive drowning, fire, and abandonment shows he watches over you still. The sentiment, offered without the platitudes that typically accompanied white Christian condolences, touched Ellie deeply. Not an assurance that William resided in heaven, watching benevolently from afar, but a more immediate suggestion of continued influence and protection, a presence that remained active in the world she still inhabited. I hope so, she replied. Simply, they settled into companionable silence as the fire burned lower, each absorbed in private thoughts, yet drawing comfort from the other's presence in this desolate landscape. Despite her continued physical discomfort and the uncertainty ahead, Ellie felt a curious sense of peace she had not experienced since before William's illness. Near midnight, as she drifted toward sleep, Thomas's voice emerged once more from the darkness beyond the fire's diminished glow. Tomorrow brings new challenges, he said quietly, but remember, you survived when others would have perished. That strength remains within you, whatever comes. The observation, delivered without expectation of response, followed Ellie into dreams that, for the first time in months, contained no echoes of grief or abandonment, only forward motion across landscapes simultaneously foreign and welcoming. Dawn arrived with disorienting brightness after the previous day's smoke-filtered light. Ellie woke to find the camp already partially dismantled, Thomas having risen earlier to prepare for their departure. Her body still ached from its ordeal, but her breathing had improved significantly, and the dangerous chill had departed from her limbs. River's Ford lies northeast, Thomas informed her, offering a breakfast of dried berries and what appeared to be pemmican. We follow creek beds where possible. Easier walking, some vegetation may have survived near water. As Ellie ate, she noted Thomas had arranged what appeared to be a small bundle of clothing beside her. Changed from well water while you slept yesterday, he explained, noticing her attention. Dried by fire overnight. Not fully clean, but better than borrowed clothes for traveling. The consideration touched her. Despite the urgency of their situation and limited resources, he had attended to details that preserved her dignity. The gesture spoke to a respect that transcended their different backgrounds and the unusual circumstances of their association. She dressed behind a suspended blanket, grateful to return to her own clothing, despite its lingering dampness and smoky odor. The simple act of wearing familiar garments provided psychological comfort that helped counterbalance physical discomfort and uncertainty. As they prepared for departure, Thomas presented her with a walking stick he had fashioned from a partially burned branch, shaped and smoothed with his knife to provide both support and potential defense if necessary. The practical gift acknowledged her continued weakness without diminishing her agency, a balance Ellie particularly appreciated after Pine Ridge's dismissive treatment. "Thank you," she said, testing the stick's weight and balance, "for everything. I'm not sure I've adequately expressed my gratitude." Thomas secured his minimal pack, distributing items with practiced efficiency. "No gratitude needed between fellow travelers," he replied. "The journey matters more than thanks." With the makeshift camp erased and fire extinguished completely, they began their trek toward River's Ford. The blackened landscape stretched eerily in all directions, familiar features rendered alien by the fire's transformation. Occasionally they passed the charred remains of wildlife that had failed to outpace the flames, grim reminders of the fate Ellie had narrowly escaped. As they walked, Thomas maintained alert vigilance, his experienced eyes continuously scanning the horizon for potential threats or resources. He set a pace that challenged Ellie's recovering strength without exceeding it, demonstrating intuitive understanding of her capabilities. Their conversation remained minimal during the morning hours, both conserving energy for the difficult terrain. When Thomas did speak, it was primarily to share practical knowledge, identifying plants beginning to emerge from the ash that might provide medicine, pointing out animal tracks indicating which creatures had already returned to the burned areas, explaining how the land would regenerate in coming seasons. By midday, they had covered approximately 5 miles, following the meandering path of a creek bed that had provided minimal protection to vegetation along its banks. Thomas called a brief halt in a small area where some greenery had survived, producing dried meat and the remainder of the morning's berries for their meal. As they rested in the shade of a partially burned cottonwood, Ellie gathered courage to ask the question that had occupied her thoughts throughout the morning. "At River's Ford," she began carefully, "what will happen? That is, will you simply deliver me to the settlement, or—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express her concerns without presuming upon his assistance or appearing overly dependent. Thomas considered her unfinished question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "River's Ford has a trading post run by a man named Jackson," he finally replied. "Former Army, married to Crow woman, respects both worlds, will help you find a place until you decide your next path." He paused, then added, "I have business there also. Will remain 2 days before returning to scouting duties." The answer provided both reassurance and a defined time frame. His assistance would continue through their arrival and initial transition, but had clear limits. Ellie appreciated the straightforward response, which neither extended false promises nor abandoned responsibility prematurely. 2 days, she echoed, nodding. "By then I should have my bearings." Thomas studied her with unexpected intensity. "Many paths will open at River's Ford. Some lead east toward familiar territories. Others lead to new possibilities." He secured his water container, preparing to resume their journey. "The fire destroys, but also clears ground for new growth. Remember this when choosing your direction." The advice, delivered without presumption yet carrying the weight of personal experience, accompanied them as they continued northeast across the gradually healing landscape. 2 individuals from vastly different worlds, temporarily united by disaster, yet discovering unexpected common ground in its aftermath. Whatever awaited at River's Ford, Ellie recognized that her journey had already been transformed in ways that transcended mere physical direction. The journey to River's Ford progressed steadily through terrain that alternated between fire-ravaged desolation and small pockets where life had somehow endured. By late afternoon of their first full day of travel, Thomas estimated they had covered nearly 12 miles, an impressive distance given Ellie's recovering condition. They made camp in a sheltered hollow where a spring-fed pool had resisted. The fire's advance, creating a small oasis of green amid the blackened landscape. "Water speaks even to fire," Thomas observed as he gathered materials for their night's shelter. "Some voices cannot be silenced, only respected." Ellie, resting, her aching legs beside the clear pool, considered the metaphor. "Like your grandmother's lullaby passing between cultures?" Thomas paused in his work, offering a rare smile that transformed his usually stoic features. "You understand such things well for one raised in white settlements. Perhaps near death. Experiences expand one's perspective," Ellie responded with dry humor that surprised herself. The ability to find even mild amusement in her ordeal suggested healing beyond the physical. As Thomas constructed a simple lean-to using salvaged branches and materials from his pack, Ellie found herself studying his methodical approach. Each action served a clear purpose. Each material was evaluated for maximum utility. Nothing was wasted or used carelessly. a stark contrast to the often profligate habits she had observed among settlers who treated frontier resources as inexhaustible. "You're very efficient," she noted, gathering herself to assist despite her fatigue. "May I help?" Thomas considered her offer, assessing her condition with a glance. "Gather these," he decided, indicating small, fibrous plants that had survived, near the water's edge. "Good for bedding, soft but keep the body from the ground's cold." The task matched her limited strength while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to their shared comfort. As she worked, Thomas skillfully set snares. In areas where animal tracks suggested potential game had already returned to the water source. His knowledge of which creatures would reappear first after fire demonstrated intimate understanding of prairie ecosystems that impressed Ellie deeply. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, as they completed preparations for the night. "About animals, plants, survival techniques?" Thomas finished securing their small shelter before answering. "Some from my father, who trapped and traded across territories, more from Mother's people who lived with this land for generations." He gestured to the horizon where the setting sun painted the smoke-tinged sky in dramatic oranges and purples. "But most from watching, listening. The land teaches those willing to learn." The simple response contained profound wisdom that resonated with Ellie's own educational philosophy. The best learning came not from rote memorization or rigid systems, but from careful observation, pattern recognition, and respectful engagement with subject matter, whether mathematics, literature, or survival skills. "I try to teach my students something similar," she reflected. "That knowledge isn't just contained in books, but in everything around us." The school board found this approach unconventional. "Conventional thinking builds walls," Thomas observed. "Walls protect, but also blind." He added kindling to their small fire with practiced precision. "Your students were fortunate to see beyond those walls, even briefly." The validation of her teaching methods, delivered without the judgment or condescension she had experienced from Pine Ridge authorities, touched Ellie unexpectedly. She had invested her heart in education, believing children deserved more than narrow preparation for predetermined roles. Thomas's simple acknowledgement of this philosophy's value affirmed her professional instincts in ways the settlement's dismissal had undermined. Their evening meal consisted of plants Thomas identified as edible despite the fire's effects, supplemented by dried provisions from his pack. As they ate, a comfortable quiet settled between them, not the awkward silence of strangers, but the natural pause of those who had moved beyond initial wariness to mutual respect. Darkness emerged fully, bringing with it a profound stillness unique to fire-ravaged landscapes. No insects chirped, no nocturnal animals rustled through underbrush, only the gentle sound of water moving in the small pool and their fire's occasional crackle interrupted the absolute quiet. "It's strange," Ellie observed, gazing into the flames. "I should feel only relief at surviving, yet I find myself mourning this land almost as I mourned William, the life that was here, now gone." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Land grieves, but also heals. First rains will bring new growth from roots that survived below ground. By next summer, prairie flowers will bloom amid black skeletal trees." He added another small branch to their fire. "Different beauty, but beauty still." The perspective offered comfort without diminishing loss, an approach to grief Ellie had not encountered among well-meaning neighbors whose platitudes after William's death had only emphasized her isolation. Thomas acknowledged both destruction and renewal as essential aspects of a single cycle, neither negating the other but existing in necessary balance. "Your people view death differently than mine," she observed. "Death walks beside all living things," Thomas responded. "White settlers often pretend not to see this companion until it cannot be ignored. Then fear overwhelms wisdom." He studied the fire thoughtfully. Lakota acknowledged death's presence in all seasons, not just moments of loss. This brings not fear, but respect for life's value. The philosophy struck Ellie as simultaneously foreign to her upbringing, yet resonant with truths she had glimpsed. During William's illness, and her own recent brush with mortality, Western society's elaborate mechanisms for distancing the living from death, from formal mourning periods to euphemisms for dying, suddenly seemed like collective self-deception rather than comfort. "I was expected to diminish after William died," she found herself explaining, "to become less visible, less engaged, to define myself solely through his absence. When I continued teaching with the same passion, it made many uncomfortable." Thomas listened without interruption, his expression revealing neither judgment nor surprise. When she finished, he offered simple observation rather than sympathy. "Eagles do not forget how to fly when they lose their mates. Why should humans forget their gifts?" The question, posed with genuine curiosity rather than rhetoric, crystallized something Ellie had felt but struggled to articulate during her months of widowhood. Her continued desire to teach, to engage fully with life, had been treated as inappropriate rather than natural. The community's discomfort stemmed not from her grief, but from her refusal to be diminished by it. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me as whole despite losses." Thomas acknowledged her words with a slight nod, before turning conversation toward practical matters. "Sleep now. Tomorrow brings more difficult terrain before River's Ford. You need strength." Despite physical exhaustion, Ellie found sleep elusive. That night, her mind actively processing new perspectives that challenged lifelong assumptions. The lean-to Thomas had constructed provided effective shelter, and the fibrous plants created surprisingly comfortable bedding, yet her thoughts remained too active for immediate rest. Beside her, Thomas appeared to sleep instantly, another survival skill she envied. His breathing established a steady rhythm, while her mind continued its explorations. Eventually, the day's exertion overcame mental activity, and Ellie drifted into dreams that mixed memories of William, images of fire, and new possibilities she had not previously considered. Dawn broke with misty coolness that hinted at changing weather patterns. Thomas had already risen, checked his snares, and rekindled their fire by the time Ellie emerged from the lean-to. A small rabbit roasted over carefully controlled flames, providing substantial breakfast that would fuel their continued journey. "Storm comes," Thomas announced, gesturing to clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Good for burned land. Challenge for travelers." Ellie observed the approaching weather system with mixed emotions. Rain would indeed benefit the fire-ravaged prairie, accelerating recovery and suppressing lingering embers. However, their journey would become more difficult, potentially dangerous if the storm brought lightning to this exposed landscape. "How far is River's Ford?" she asked, assessing their options. 8 miles, perhaps 9, Thomas estimated. "If we maintain yesterday's pace, we reach settlement before the worst weather arrives." They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal evidence of their presence beside the small pool. Thomas demonstrated how to disguise their fire site and return materials to the landscape in ways that maintained natural balances. The practice contrasted sharply with settler habits Ellie had observed, where camps often became permanent scars on the land through careless refuse and resource extraction. Another lesson not taught in settlement schools, she observed as they prepared to depart. "Important lessons rarely appear in books," Thomas replied. "They come from living closely with the consequences of their actions." The observation carried philosophical depth beyond immediate context. Ellie considered how Pine Ridge residents, insulated from immediate consequences of their social strictures and prejudices, maintained systems that damaged individuals and relationships without recognizing the ultimate cost to their community. Their second day's journey proved more challenging than the first. The terrain grew increasingly uneven as they approached the river valley that housed their destination. Hills that had channeled the fire's intensity in specific patterns created a complex mosaic of completely devastated areas, alongside patches where the flames had mysteriously bypassed vulnerable vegetation. Thomas maintained vigilant attention to their surroundings, occasionally adjusting their route to maximize both efficiency and safety. His knowledge of the landscape proved invaluable, as gathering clouds gradually obscured landmarks that might have guided less experienced travelers. By mid-morning, they crested a significant ridge that offered their first distant view of rivers. Ford, a modest collection of structures nestled in the valley where a shallow section of the river provided natural crossing. From this distance, the settlement appeared untouched by the fire that had ravaged the surrounding prairie, protected by the water barrier and prevailing winds that had directed flames elsewhere. "Larger than I expected," Ellie commented, surveying. Approximately 30 buildings, arranged along what appeared to be a main street running parallel to the river. Trading post, stables, boarding house, Thomas identified. Several families, some single men who work river transport. Mixed settlement, white traders, some French-Canadian trappers, native women who married outside tribes. He nodded toward the northern edge. Small mission building, though no permanent minister. The diversity he described suggested a community fundamentally different from Pine Ridge's homogeneous population and rigid social structure. Whether this heterogeneity translated to greater acceptance remained uncertain, but the possibility intrigued Ellie as they began their descent toward the valley. The approaching storm accelerated its advance, dark clouds mounting in dramatic formations that generated gusting winds ahead of the rainfall. These winds carried the acrid scent of ash from burned areas, creating swirling clouds of black particles that reduced visibility and complicated breathing. Thomas produced a spare bandana from his pack, offering it to Ellie for protection. "Cover mouth and nose," he instructed. "Ash carries fire's memory in ways that harm the lungs," the simple precaution demonstrating both practical knowledge and considerate foresight. As they continued downslope toward River's Ford, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, initially as scattered percussion against fire-hardened ground, then with increasing intensity that quickly transformed dusty ash into slippery mud. "Carefully. Now," Thomas cautioned as the path grew treacherous. "River Valley steepens here before final approach." Despite his warning and Ellie's caution, the combination of unstable terrain, increasing rainfall, and her still recovering strength eventually proved treacherous. On a particularly steep section, her foot slid unexpectedly in newly formed mud. The walking stick Thomas had provided prevented complete collapse but twisted sharply under her weight, sending pain lancing through her already tender wrist. Thomas was beside her instantly, his reflexes remarkable as he stabilized her before she could fall completely. "Injured?" he asked with concerned efficiency. "Just my wrist," Ellie assured him, though the discomfort suggested possible sprain rather than mere twinge. "I can continue." Thomas assessed both her condition and the deteriorating weather with practiced skill. "Shelter first," he decided. "Storm strengthens before reaching settlement. Not wise to continue on dangerous ground." Within minutes, he identified a suitable location, a rocky overhang that provided natural protection from both rainfall and wind. With efficient movements, he established a minimal camp, using materials from his pack combined with surrounding resources to create windbreak that enhanced the natural shelter. Once protected from the intensifying storm, Thomas gently examined Ellie's injured wrist. His touch maintained professional distance while demonstrating surprising gentleness. "Not broken," he concluded, strained only, should heal with proper care. From a small pouch, he produced what appeared to be dried herbs, crushed a portion between his fingers and added water from his canteen to create poultice. Medicine from winter root, he explained, applying the mixture carefully. Reduces swelling, eases pain. The treatment immediately produced a cooling sensation that diminished discomfort. Thomas completed the process by wrapping the wrist firmly, but not tightly, with a strip of clean cloth from his seemingly inexhaustible supplies. "You're quite the doctor," Ellie observed, testing the bandaged joint with careful movement. "Not a doctor. Like your husband," Thomas demurred. "Only knowledge passed through generations. Every Lakota child learns basic healing plants and their uses. Knowledge needn't have degrees or certificates to hold value," Ellie responded, thinking of Pine Ridge's dismissal of her teaching because it came from a woman rather than a formally accredited male instructor. Thomas acknowledged her point with a slight nod before turning attention to the storm now raging around their shelter. Rain fell in sheets, transforming the fire-hardened landscape into flowing rivulets that carried ash and debris toward the valley floor. Occasional lightning illuminated the scene with stark brilliance, followed by thunder that reverberated through the hillside. "Nature balances," Thomas observed, watching water reclaim dominance over landscape so recently transformed by fire. "Destroyer becomes healer when cycle completes." The philosophical observation seemed particularly apt as they sheltered from one elemental force that would ultimately repair damage caused by another. Ellie found herself reconsidering many assumptions that had structured her previous understanding about nature's patterns, about human communities, about her own capacity for adaptation. "Will we reach River's Ford today?" she asked, assessing the storm's intensity. Thomas studied the weather patterns with an experienced eye. "Storm passes quickly. Summer pattern, intense but brief. We continue when safe. Reach settlement before nightfall." His prediction proved accurate. Within an hour, the storm's fury began to diminish, rainfall lightening from torrential to steady. Wind patterns shifted, pushing the weather system eastward across the prairie. Though the ground remained slick with mud and accumulated water, conditions had improved enough to permit cautious travel. With Thomas's assistance, Ellie navigated the remaining descent toward River's Ford, her injured wrist protected by both bandaging and extra care in their progress. The final approach to the settlement revealed a community stirring back to activity after the storm's interruption. Smoke rose from chimneys, figures moved between buildings, and the general atmosphere suggested functional society rather than the desperate evacuation she had witnessed at Pine Ridge. As they reached the settlement's edge, Ellie became acutely aware of her appearance, clothing smoke-damaged and mud-stained, hair tangled from days without proper attention, general demeanor marked by evident hardship. Beside her, Thomas maintained the composed dignity that seemed his natural state. "Regardless of circumstances, Jackson's trading post first," he indicated, gesturing toward substantial structure near the settlement center. "He knows many in River's Ford, can advise best arrangements." The simple strategy acknowledged both her immediate needs and the complicated social dynamics her arrival with Lakota escort might generate. As they moved through muddy streets toward their destination, Ellie noted curious glances from residents, but nothing approaching the overt suspicion or judgment she had feared. The trading post occupied a well-constructed two-story building with a covered porch that had provided shelter for several men during the recent downpour. These individuals observed their approach with evident interest, conversation pausing as Thomas and Ellie neared the steps. One man, distinguished by significant Height and substantial beard streaked with grey, stepped forward with recognition, lighting his weathered features. "Swift Arrow," he greeted Thomas with genuine warmth. "Didn't expect to see you before the next supply convoy." "Jackson," Thomas acknowledged with a respectful nod. Circumstances changed. Fire altered many paths. Jackson's attention shifted. To Ellie, curiosity evident but tempered by frontier courtesy that respected privacy. "Ma'am," he greeted her simply, "you look like you've had quite a journey." "More adventure than I anticipated," Ellie admitted, finding unexpected comfort in the straightforward acknowledgement of her condition without accompanying judgment. Thomas provided a concise explanation that communicated essential information while respecting Ellie's dignity. Mrs. Mitchell survived settlement evacuation and prairie fire by taking shelter in an abandoned well, was traveling to River's Ford when our paths crossed. The deliberate phrasing, technically accurate while omitting her near drowning and his rescue, allowed Ellie to retain agency in the narrative rather than being presented as a helpless victim. She appreciated this subtle consideration more than elaborate courtesies. Jackson processed the information with thoughtful nod. "Sounds like quite a tale, Mrs. Mitchell. One best continued inside with hot coffee and proper rest." He gestured toward the trading post door with hospitable certainty. "Martha will get you settled while Thomas brings me up to speed on fire conditions. We've had conflicting reports from various travelers." The simple acceptance of her presence, without interrogation or evident suspicion, eased tension Ellie hadn't fully acknowledged she carried. As she followed Jackson's direction toward promised comfort, she glanced back at Thomas, whose slight nod conveyed reassurance about this transition. The trading post's interior offered organized abundance that contrasted sharply with her recent experiences of deprivation. Shelves lined with goods ranging from practical necessities to modest luxuries, cooking aromas suggesting recent meal preparation and general atmosphere of established commerce all reminded Ellie of the civilized framework she had temporarily departed. Martha Jackson, a striking woman whose features revealed mixed native and European heritage, emerged from the back room with practical efficiency that matched her husband's demeanor. Her assessment of Ellie's condition required only moments before she took gentle command of the situation. "Bath first," she decided with friendly authority. "Then clean clothes and a hot meal. Stories can wait until you're properly restored." The simple kindness, offering essential comfort without demanding immediate explanation, brought unexpected emotion to Ellie's throat. After days of survival focus and months of community rejection, this straightforward acceptance of her humanity without qualification felt revolutionary. "Thank you," she managed, surprised by the catch in her voice. "Your hospitality means more than I can express." Martha's expression softened with understanding beyond words. "Sometimes the journey changes us more than the destination," she observed quietly. "The person who arrives isn't quite the same one who departed." The insight, offered by a woman who clearly understood existence between cultural boundaries, resonated deeply with Ellie's emerging recognition of her own transformation. The fire had claimed her remaining physical connections to her previous life, but something new had begun forming in that destruction's aftermath. Something still taking shape, but undeniably real. As Martha led her toward promised comforts, Ellie glanced back to where Thomas conversed quietly with Jackson. Their eyes met briefly across the trading post's busy interior, and Thomas offered an almost imperceptible nod that somehow conveyed both reassurance about her immediate security and acknowledgement of significant transition. The silent exchange confirmed what Ellie had begun to recognize during their journey. The well that had nearly claimed her life had also marked an unmistakable boundary between her past and whatever future now awaited. Like the prairie after fire's transformation, that future remained partially obscured but contained possibilities for growth that could not have existed without preceding destruction. Eleanor Mitchell woke to unfamiliar comfort. After Martha Jackson's ministrations the previous evening, hot bath, clean borrowed clothing, and simple but nourishing meal, she had fallen into profound sleep in the small but tidy room above the trading post. Sunlight now streamed through calico curtains, illuminating surroundings that represented civilization's return to her existence. For several moments, Ellie remained motionless, reacquainting herself with mundane comforts, a proper mattress, rather than makeshift bedding on hard ground, the scent of laundered linens instead of smoke and ash, the distant sounds of commercial activity replacing nature's unpredictable rhythms. These ordinary elements felt simultaneously familiar and strange after her transformative journey. A soft knock preceded Martha's entrance with steaming coffee and fresh bread. "Good morning," she greeted Ellie with friendly efficiency. "Thought you might welcome breakfast before facing the day." "Thank you," Ellie replied, genuinely appreciative. "I'm not sure I've ever appreciated a real bed quite so much." Martha smiled understanding as she placed the tray on a small side table. "Sometimes we need to lose comforts to truly value them." She paused, assessing Ellie with a perceptive gaze. "Though I suspect you've gained as much as you've lost in recent days." The observation, offered without presumption, yet penetrating in its accuracy, reflected Martha's evident insight into transitions between worlds. Before Ellie could formulate a response, Martha continued with practical information. "Your clothes weren't salvageable, I'm afraid. Too much smoke damage and river mud. I've arranged some replacements from our stock." She gestured toward garments draped over a chair. Simple but serviceable dress, undergarments, and sturdy boots. "Charles, my husband, says to consider. Them settlements welcome, no payment needed." The generosity touched Ellie deeply after Pine Ridge's calculated withdrawal of support. "That's incredibly kind, but I can't simply—" "You can and will," Martha interrupted firmly but kindly. "Rivers Ford understands helping travelers in need. When you're established, you'll do the same for others. That's how communities survive out here." The philosophy contrasted sharply with Pine Ridge's rigid social accounting, where assistance carried explicit expectations of conformity and deference. Martha's straightforward approach suggested different values operated in this mixed settlement. Reciprocity based on shared humanity rather than adherence to hierarchical structures. "Thomas mentioned you were a teacher," Martha continued. "When you're ready, Charles would like to discuss settlement needs. Rivers Ford has 15 children of school age with no formal instruction since last winter, when the circuit teacher moved on." The casual mention of potential purpose struck Ellie with unexpected force. She had assumed her teaching career effectively ended with Pine Ridge's rejection, yet here was a possibility emerging before she'd even requested it. The opportunity represented not mere employment, but restoration of identity, separated from marital status or community judgment. "I'd welcome that conversation," Ellie managed, emotion threatening her composure. Martha nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Children need knowledge beyond what parents alone can provide." She moved toward the door with practiced efficiency. "Come down when you're ready. No rush. Your body deserves recovery time." After Martha departed, Ellie savored the simple breakfast while organizing thoughts that seemed as jumbled as the prairie landscape after fire and rain. Her circumstances had transformed so radically in recent days that assessing current position proved challenging. From established teacher to rejected widow to fire survivor to potential new beginning, the transitions had occurred with disorienting speed. The borrowed garments fit reasonably well, though the dress hung slightly loose on her frame, evidence of weight lost during recent ordeals. As Ellie dressed, she caught a glimpse of herself in a small mirror mounted on the wall. The woman reflected, there appeared simultaneously familiar and foreign. Recognizable features now framed by wind-tangled hair and marked by subtle changes in expression and posture. Physical details hadn't significantly altered, yet something fundamental had shifted in ways the mirror couldn't capture, but she could clearly sense. Downstairs, the trading post buzzed with morning activity. Several customers examined goods or conducted business with Charles Jackson, whose resonant voice and efficient movements demonstrated long experience managing commerce in frontier conditions. At a side table, Thomas Swift Arrow conversed quietly with another Native American man whose clothing suggested Pawnee rather than Lakota affiliation. Thomas noticed her entrance immediately, acknowledging her presence with a subtle nod before returning attention to his conversation. The gesture conveyed both awareness and respect for her independence, recognition without presumption of immediate engagement. Ellie appreciated this consideration as she oriented herself within the busy environment. Charles Jackson concluded business with current customer before approaching with a welcoming smile that transformed his weathered features. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted her. "Good to see you, vertical and recovering. Martha says you've managed solid rest?" "Better than I expected," Ellie confirmed. "Your hospitality has been remarkable, especially toward a complete stranger." "Thomas vouches for you," Jackson replied simply. "That carries significant weight." Here, the statement revealed something important about Rivers Ford's social structure. Trust extended across cultural boundaries in ways Pine Ridge would have found incomprehensible. Thomas's assessment of her character mattered to Jackson, not despite cultural differences, but because his position, spanning those differences, provided valuable perspective. "Martha mentioned the settlement needs a teacher," Ellie ventured, testing. This apparent openness, Jackson's expression brightened visibly. "Desperately. Had traveling instructor until February when he continued to Oregon Territory. Since then, parents manage as they can, but proper education requires dedicated attention." He gestured toward a chair at a nearby table. "Would you consider discussing possibilities while breaking your fast properly? Coffee here can't match Martha's, but accompanying eggs and bacon compensate for the difference." The invitation, delivered with relaxed hospitality rather than formal negotiation, further demonstrated Rivers Ford's contrasting approach. As Ellie joined Jackson at the indicated table, she noticed Thomas concluding his conversation with the Pawnee man who departed through the trading post's main entrance. "News from western settlements," Thomas explained, approaching their table. "Fire damage is widespread but inconsistent. Many communities are preserved by shifting winds." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "Consistent with reports from the south. Strange. Fire patterns this season. Devastating in some areas, mysteriously bypassing others equally vulnerable." He gestured for Thomas to join them. "Major Henderson still expects you back tomorrow?" "Unless conditions change," Thomas confirmed, accepting a seat while declining offered coffee with a polite gesture. "Scouting parties assess fire's aftermath, monitor displaced populations." The practical exchange revealed ongoing coordination between military units and indigenous scouts that transcended simplified hostility Ellie had often heard described in settler communities. Reality appeared considerably more complex than Pine Ridge's narrative of perpetual threat from savage raiders. "Now," Jackson said, returning attention to Ellie, "about teaching possibilities. Rivers Ford operates differently from established eastern settlements, more practical arrangements based on community needs rather than formal institutions." Over the next half hour, Jackson outlined the situation with forthright clarity. The settlement's children ranged from 5 to 16 years, with varied educational backgrounds depending on previous exposure to instruction. No dedicated school building existed, Though community gathering space could serve educational purposes, compensation would combine modest cash payment with practical support, housing, supplies, additional food from participating families. Not luxurious circumstances, Jackson acknowledged, but the opportunity to build something meaningful. These children represent the future for a community where different traditions must learn to strengthen rather than threaten each other. The vision resonated deeply with Ellie's educational philosophy, learning as a bridge between different perspectives rather than mere transmission of established doctrine. Pine Ridge had increasingly resisted her attempts to introduce broader worldviews into curriculum, preferring narrow focus on skills that maintained existing social structures. "I'd like to meet the families," Ellie responded, "understand their expectations before making commitments, but the possibility certainly interests me." Jackson appeared pleased with her measured response. "Perfectly reasonable. Martha can introduce you to several parents this afternoon if you feel sufficiently recovered. No pressure for immediate decision. Community understands you've experienced significant trauma." As their conversation continued, Ellie noticed increasing activity outside the trading post windows. A small crowd had gathered in the street, attention focused on approaching riders whose military bearing suggested official rather than civilian presence. Thomas observed this development with a subtle shift in posture that communicated heightened alertness without obvious alarm. "Army patrol," Jackson identified, following their gazes. "Earlier than usual this month, likely responding to fire conditions." The patrol, 4 uniformed soldiers led by an officer whose insignia identified him as captain, halted before the trading post. Their appearance suggested extended travel through difficult conditions, uniforms showing evidence of smoke exposure and hard usage. The captain dismounted with practiced efficiency, scanning surroundings with professional assessment before entering the establishment. Conversation ceased as military presence commanded immediate attention. The captain removed his hat upon entry, revealing sweat-dampened hair and face bearing several days' stubble. His eyes moved purposefully across the trading post's interior, pausing momentarily on Thomas before settling on Jackson with recognition. "Charles," he acknowledged with clipped cordiality. "Unexpected patrol. Fire conditions warranted assessment of outlying settlements." "Captain Wilson," Jackson returned evenly. "Rivers Ford escaped damage, though the surrounding prairie was less fortunate. Coffee?" The established rapport suggested previous acquaintance, though Ellie sensed underlying tension beneath surface civility. Captain Wilson offered refreshment with a brief nod before addressing the purpose directly. "Tracking potential complications following evacuation patterns," he stated, gaze shifting deliberately toward Thomas. "Reports of unusual movements among previously uninvolved bands, some taking advantage of disruption to approach settlements." The implication carried unmistakable weight, despite careful phrasing. Thomas met the captain's evaluating look with impassive dignity, neither acknowledging nor challenging the embedded suggestion of threat. "Swift Arrow's scouting unit with Major Henderson provides regular updates on such matters," Jackson observed pointedly. "Their reports indicate no unusual activity beyond normal displacement from fire-affected areas." Wilson's attention shifted to Ellie, registering her presence with professional assessment. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a brief nod. "New to Rivers Ford?" Before Ellie could respond, the trading post door opened to admit another soldier, whose urgency suggested important development. He approached the captain with respectful efficiency, speaking quietly, but not so softly that others couldn't overhear. "Sir, riders from Pine Ridge Settlement arrived. Mayor Reynolds requests immediate consultation regarding the situation." Ellie felt a sudden chill at the settlement's name, intensified when the soldier added, "They're asking about a missing woman, schoolteacher, named Mitchell. All eyes turned toward Ellie as connections formed with unavoidable clarity. Captain. Wilson's expression sharpened with renewed interest, reassessing her presence with Thomas in light of this information. "Mrs. Mitchell?" he inquired directly. Ellie gathered her composure, determined to establish narrative before others imposed their interpretation. "Eleanor Mitchell, yes. Formerly of Pine Ridge Settlement. Reported missing during evacuation," Wilson stated, rather than asked. "Settlement leadership expressed concern about your whereabouts." The diplomatic phrasing barely disguised underlying implications. Thomas remained silent but watchful, allowing Ellie to address the situation without interference while maintaining protective presence. "I wasn't missing," Ellie corrected firmly. "I was excluded from evacuation arrangements after losing my teaching position following my husband's death. The Settlement Council made their priorities clear when the crisis came." Her direct response clearly surprised Wilson, who had evidently anticipated a different scenario based on whatever information Pine Ridge representatives had provided. Jackson's supportive presence beside her reinforced her position, his established reputation lending credibility to her account. "Perhaps we should discuss this with Mayor Reynolds and his companions," Wilson suggested, with professional neutrality that neither confirmed nor denied acceptance of her explanation. "Of course," Ellie agreed, surprising herself with steady resolve. "Though there's little to discuss beyond the facts already stated. I survived independently when necessary, received assistance when fortunate, and am now considering Rivers Ford's teaching opportunity." The simplified narrative deliberately omitted Thomas's crucial role, protecting him from potential complications while maintaining essential truth. She had indeed survived independently by reaching the well through her own determination, even if subsequent rescue had proven necessary. Wilson studied her with a reassessing gaze before making a decision. "Mayor Reynolds awaits at our temporary camp. Would you accompany me there to resolve this situation officially? Your companion is welcome to attend as well." The careful phrasing acknowledged Thomas's presence without defining his relationship. To Ellie, a diplomatic ambiguity that maintained multiple interpretations. Thomas looked to Ellie, clearly allowing her to determine appropriate response rather than assuming decision-making authority. "I'll come," she confirmed, "though I'd prefer Mr. Jackson's accompaniment as settlement representative if he's willing." The strategic choice balanced multiple considerations. Jackson's established position provided legitimate protection while avoiding potential complications from Thomas's presence among potentially hostile Pine Ridge representatives. Thomas's slight nod confirmed approval of her reasoning. "Certainly," Jackson agreed immediately. "Martha can mind the store briefly. Professional courtesy between settlements seems appropriate." Wilson accepted this arrangement with military efficiency. "We'll proceed when you're ready, Mrs. Mitchell." As Jackson informed Martha of temporary absence, Thomas approached Ellie with measured steps that maintained appropriate distance for public interaction. "Eyes see what they expect," he observed quietly. "Some cannot recognize truth that challenges expectation." The cryptic statement contained both warning and encouragement. Pine Ridge representatives would likely maintain narrative convenient to their purposes, rather than acknowledging abandonment of vulnerable community member. "I know who I am," Ellie responded with newfound certainty. "Even if others prefer a different story." Thomas's expression softened momentarily. "Remember this when facing those who would rewrite your journey." He glanced toward Wilson, who organized departure arrangements with professional focus. "Captain serves military interests. First, truth ranks below order in such calculations." The assessment, delivered without rancor but with clear-eyed perception, reminded Ellie that frontier politics operated through complex webs of influence, where official versions often prevailed regardless of accuracy. Her status as a female survivor, without male protection or established position, placed her at distinct disadvantage in such an environment. Jackson returned with his hat and light jacket, suitable for morning's lingering coolness. "Ready when you are," he told Ellie with reassuring confidence. Rivers Ford stands behind its prospective teacher. The simple declaration of community support, even potential support, contrasted sharply with Pine Ridge's calculated abandonment. As they prepared to depart, Ellie caught Thomas's final glance, which conveyed a complicated message without words: caution regarding unknown intentions, confidence in her capacity to maintain truth, and reminder of alternative futures beyond. Whatever confrontation awaited, outside, the morning sun illuminated Rivers Ford with clarity that emphasized its practical arrangements rather than performative appearances. And like Pine Ridge's careful adherence to Eastern architectural conventions, this settlement had evolved organically based on function and available materials. The resulting atmosphere suggested a community designed for survival rather than impression. Management. As Wilson led them toward a military camp established at the settlement's edge, Ellie gathered inner resources for imminent confrontation. The approaching meeting represented more than a simple explanation of circumstances. It constituted a choice between returning to established but restrictive patterns versus embracing unfamiliar but potentially expansive possibilities. Pine Ridge offered known limitations within a recognized social framework. Rivers Ford presented an uncertain opportunity within a flexible community structure. Between these options stood Thomas Swift Arrow's example of navigating multiple worlds without surrendering essential authenticity, perhaps the most challenging path, but also most aligned with her emerging sense of self. With each step toward confrontation with her past, Eleanor Mitchell moved simultaneously toward a decision about her future, a convergence of trajectories set in motion by fire's destructive force, yet potentially leading toward unexpected renewal. The military camp occupied a flat area at Rivers Ford's eastern edge, positioned to maximize visibility across surrounding prairie while maintaining proximity to settlement resources. 6 canvas tents arranged in precise formation housed Captain Wilson's patrol, while a larger central tent evidently served administrative purposes. Outside this command center stood 3 horses bearing Pine Ridge Settlement's distinctive bridle markings, tangible evidence that Ellie's past had literally caught up with her present. As they approached, Captain Wilson maintained professional courtesy that revealed nothing of his personal assessment regarding the situation. "Mayor Reynolds and 2 council members arrived an hour ago," he informed them. "They've reported significant concern about your welfare following the settlement evacuation." The diplomatic phrasing contrasted with Ellie's vivid recollection of deliberate exclusion from evacuation arrangements. Rather than challenge this characterization immediately, she simply nodded acknowledgement, conserving emotional resources for the confrontation ahead. "I appreciate your facilitating this meeting, Captain," Jackson interjected smoothly. "Rivers Ford values cooperative relations with military units and neighboring settlements alike." The strategic statement established Jackson's position as community representative rather than merely Ellie's supporter, a subtle but important distinction that elevated the interaction from personal dispute to settlement-level diplomacy. Wilson's brief nod suggested recognition of this framing as they reached the command tent. "Mayor Reynolds," Wilson announced as they entered, "Mrs. Mitchell has been located, safe in Rivers Ford. Mr. Jackson accompanies her as settlement representative." The tent's interior contained basic field furniture, folding table, several chairs, and a map display showing regional terrain with fire damage marked in red. Seated at the table, Harold Reynolds appeared unchanged from Ellie's last encounter before the fire. Substantial physique straining his waistcoat buttons, complexion flushed with habitual indulgence, expression conveying authority he considered natural birthright rather than earned responsibility. Beside him sat Pastor Whitfield, whose pinched features suggested perpetual disapproval, and Franklin Peterson, the newly arrived teacher whose appointment had precipitated Ellie's dismissal. Their collective presence represented Pine Ridge's power structure in concentrated form, political, religious, and educational authority united in common purpose. Reynolds rose with theatrical relief that immediately struck Ellie as performative, rather than genuine. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank the Lord you're safe. The settlement has been beside itself with worry since discovering your absence during evacuation accounting." The blatant mischaracterization momentarily stunned Ellie with its audacity. She had been explicitly excluded from evacuation arrangements, yet Reynolds now portrayed the settlement as concerned rescuers rather than deliberate abandoners. The narrative revision demonstrated breathtaking commitment to appearances over reality. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't immediately escalate tension, Jackson intervened with deliberate courtesy. "Mayor Reynolds, I'm Charles Jackson, Rivers Ford's trading post proprietor and council representative. We're pleased to facilitate resolution of any misunderstandings regarding Mrs. Mitchell's circumstances." The diplomatic introduction established a cooperative tone, while subtly signaling that Ellie had settlement support, rather than standing isolated against Pine Ridge's united front. Reynolds acknowledged Jackson with a perfunctory nod before returning attention to Ellie. "When the final evacuation count revealed your absence, we feared the worst," he continued. "Commitment to fabricated narrative unwavering. Search parties were impossible given fire conditions, but we've been making inquiries throughout the region since reaching safety." Each statement constructed alternate reality so divergent from actual events that Ellie struggled to maintain composed expression. Reynolds had personally informed her that evacuation transportation prioritized families with children, making her special circumstances her own responsibility. No mention of search parties or regional inquiries had occurred until her presence. In Rivers Ford's somehow warranted reclamation. "Your concern seems belated, Mr. Reynolds," she finally responded, keeping her voice level despite internal turbulence. "Particularly given your explicit statement that I should make independent arrangements, as community resources couldn't accommodate everyone." Reynolds' expression flickered momentarily before recovering practiced sincerity. "An unfortunate misunderstanding during crisis conditions. Clearly my attempt to suggest you might prefer independent travel options was taken as exclusion. The council never intended for abandonment." The brazen reframing demonstrated skilled manipulation that might have intimidated Ellie in earlier circumstances. Now, having survived genuine abandonment followed by fire and near drowning, such rhetorical maneuvers seemed almost pitiably transparent rather than authoritative. "Intentions aside," she replied evenly, "I found myself without evacuation assistance, while every council member's family received priority transportation. Fortunately, I located a shelter that preserved my life despite the fire's approach." Captain Wilson, observing this exchange with professional neutrality that suggested experience with civilian disputes, interjected practical question. "How exactly did you survive the fire, Mrs. Mitchell? Reports indicate complete devastation throughout that region." The straightforward inquiry provided an opportunity to establish factual narrative before Pine Ridge representatives could further revise history. Ellie described her journey to the Henderson property, the well that provided crucial shelter and subsequent rescue by Thomas's scouting party, presenting events accurately while emphasizing her own agency rather than victimhood requiring. "External salvation, extraordinary survival," Wilson commented when she finished, genuine respect evident beneath professional demeanor. Few would have demonstrated such resourcefulness in crisis conditions. Reynolds dismissed this assessment with an impatient gesture. Nonetheless, Mrs. Mitchell clearly experienced a traumatic ordeal that requires proper recovery among a familiar community. We've come to escort her back to Pine Ridge, where arrangements have been made for her comfort and care. The presumptuous announcement revealed the actual purpose behind Pine Ridge's sudden concern. Not genuine welfare considerations, but reassertion of authority over community member who had survived despite their effective abandonment. Such independence potentially undermined settlement hierarchy if left unaddressed, particularly given Ellie's previous resistance to diminished status following widowhood. "That's most considerate," Jackson responded, before Ellie could formulate an appropriately measured reply. However, Mrs. Mitchell has been discussing potential teaching position here in Rivers Ford. Our settlement has 15 school-age children currently without instruction. This revelation visibly startled the Pine Ridge delegation. Pastor Whitfield's perpetual frown deepened while Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Reynolds recovered first, expression recalibrating to incorporate this unexpected development. While admirable, such arrangements seemed premature given Mrs. Mitchell's recent ordeal, he pronounced with paternal certainty. Additionally, her legal residence remains Pine Ridge, where property considerations require resolution. The reference to property struck purposefully at practical vulnerability. Ellie's cabin and possessions, while legally hers through Williams' explicit deed provisions, existed within settlement boundaries where access required community cooperation. Reynolds implicitly threatened these assets while presenting concern for her welfare, characteristic combination of practical leverage and moral posturing. "My cabin likely perished in the fire," Ellie observed, having witnessed flames approaching the settlement's northern edge where her home stood. "Fortunately preserved," Reynolds countered smoothly, "though considerable smoke damage requires attention. Another reason your presence is needed, to secure your property before opportunistic elements attempt acquisition during your absence. The transparent manipulation might have proven effective before recent experiences expanded Ellie's perspective. Now, having survived through resourcefulness rather than community support, material considerations carried diminished weight against newfound understanding of her own capabilities. Mrs. Mitchell's property rights remain legally protected regardless of her physical presence, Jackson noted with casual authority that suggested business acumen. Nebraska territory statutes specifically preserve ownership claims during owner absence due to natural disasters. Documentation can be filed with territorial offices confirming these circumstances. The informed intervention demonstrated Rivers Ford's substantial difference from Pine Ridge, providing practical support rather than leveraging vulnerability. Reynolds' expression tightened momentarily before reassuming solicitous concern. "Legal technicalities aside, Mrs. Mitchell's place remains with her established community," he insisted, glancing toward Pastor Whitfield for moral reinforcement. The pastor adopted an appropriate expression of pastoral concern. "A widow requires community support, particularly following a traumatic experience. Scripture teaches us to care for those in vulnerable circumstances. Pine Ridge stands ready to fulfill this Christian obligation." The religious framing attempted to elevate settlement's position from self-interest to moral imperative. Strategy Ellie had observed frequently during community deliberations where practical advantages disguised themselves as ethical principles. Before recent experiences, such appeals might have triggered guilt or obligation. Now they simply revealed manipulative intent behind superficial concern. "I appreciate Pine Ridge's belated interest in my welfare," Ellie responded with deliberate emphasis that highlighted timing incongruity. "However, My circumstances have changed significantly. The fire that nearly claimed my life also burned away certain illusions about community obligations. Her direct approach clearly discomfited the Pine Ridge delegation, who had anticipated either grateful acceptance of their rescue or, at minimum, continued deference to established authority. Reynolds attempted recovery with a shift to practical considerations. Regardless of philosophical reassessments, practical realities remain, he stated firmly. Your position at Pine Ridge included housing considerations that Rivers Ford cannot match. Additionally, your husband's outstanding accounts with settlement merchants require resolution. The reference to supposed debts represented expected escalation, financial obligation as leverage when moral appeals proved insufficient. Jackson interrupted this maneuver with professional interest natural to his trading position. Outstanding accounts, he inquired with businesslike neutrality. Documentation would facilitate appropriate resolution through territorial exchange processes. Reynolds appeared momentarily disconcerted by this procedural response, rather than emotional reaction. The Settlement Council maintains records of community obligations. Mrs. Mitchell has been granted considerable flexibility regarding repayment timelines, given her circumstances. Interesting, Jackson commented mildly, since territorial commerce regulations require written documentation of debts exceeding $20, with signatures from both parties. I'd be happy to review these documents as Rivers Ford's business representative to ensure proper handling during this unusual situation. The precise reference to legal requirements undermined Reynolds's vague assertions, particularly given Dr. Mitchell's meticulous record-keeping that would have documented any legitimate obligations. Once again, Rivers Ford demonstrated practical support that contrasted sharply with Pine Ridge's manipulative approach. Captain Wilson, who had observed this exchange with professional detachment suggesting familiarity with settler disputes, evidently decided sufficient discussion had occurred. "Gentlemen," he interjected with authority that temporarily silenced both parties, "this appears to be a civil matter beyond military jurisdiction. Mrs. Mitchell clearly survived evacuation through her own resourcefulness and currently faces no immediate danger requiring intervention." He turned to Ellie with formal courtesy that nonetheless conveyed genuine respect. "Mrs. Mitchell, as Army representative, I must confirm your current situation results from free choice rather than coercion or misconception. Are you under any constraint regarding your movements or decisions?" The direct question stripped away rhetorical manipulations and social pressures, reducing the situation to its essential element, her personal agency. Ellie straightened almost unconsciously, finding strength in this straightforward acknowledgement of her autonomy. "I am under no constraint, Captain Wilson," she replied with matching directness. "I survived the fire through my own efforts, received assistance afterward from Thomas Swift Arrow's scouting party, and have been welcomed by Rivers Ford community while considering their teaching opportunity. My decisions are my own." Wilson nodded once, accepting this statement as sufficient resolution from a military perspective. "Then my patrol's involvement concludes. Civil matters regarding property or community obligations should proceed through appropriate territorial channels." He gestured toward the tent entrance, signaling the meeting's conclusion. "Mayor Reynolds, we appreciate your concern for settlement member welfare, particularly during crisis conditions." The diplomatic dismissal left Reynolds momentarily speechless. His authority superseded by military procedure that recognized Ellie's autonomy rather than settlement's claims. Pastor Whitfield appeared equally discomfited by this unexpected outcome, while Peterson maintained studied neutrality befitting his tenuous position as Ellie's replacement. Outside the command tent, morning sunlight illuminated Rivers Ford with Clarity that emphasized its practical arrangements and diverse community composition. Several residents moved about daily business, including a mother with 3 children whose curious glances suggested awareness of an unusual meeting occurring in a military camp. Among observers stood Thomas Swift Arrow, positioned unobtrusively near the trading post entrance with characteristic alertness that missed nothing while drawing minimal attention. Mrs. Mitchell, Reynolds attempted one final appeal as they emerged. Reconsider this hasty decision. Pine Ridge offers an established community with proper social arrangements and familiar surroundings. These alternative settlements lack appropriate structure for someone of your background. The concerning phrasing, alternative settlements, and appropriate structure, revealed fundamental objection beneath superficial concern. Riversford's mixed population and fluid social arrangements threatened Pine Ridge's rigid hierarchies and cultural segregation. Ellie's potential integration into such a community represented more than individual choice. It constituted an implicit challenge to the established order Reynolds represented. "I appreciate your concern," Ellie responded with newfound clarity that surprised even herself. "However, recent experiences have expanded my understanding of the community beyond familiar arrangements. Riversford offers the opportunity to contribute meaningfully through teaching while participating in a community that values diverse perspectives rather than enforcing rigid conformity." The straightforward declaration silenced Reynolds more effectively than confrontational rejection might have achieved. His expression revealed a momentary glimpse of genuine comprehension, recognition that fundamental values divergence, rather than mere circumstantial misunderstanding, separated their positions. "The Settlement Council will process appropriate documentation regarding your property and outstanding obligations," he finally stated, retreating to procedural matters when persuasion failed. "Should you reconsider this impulsive decision, Pine Ridge remains prepared to reintegrate you appropriately." The conditional phrasing revealed unchanged perspective, despite recent conversation. Reintegration on settlement terms, rather than genuine community membership based on mutual respect. Ellie simply nodded, acknowledgement without further engagement, recognizing futility of continued dialogue between fundamentally incompatible worldviews. As Pine Ridge representatives departed toward their waiting horses, Captain Wilson offered brief military courtesy before returning to his duties, professional neutrality maintained throughout this civilian matter. Jackson remained beside Ellie, his steady presence providing quiet support without imposing direction or expectations. "Well," he observed as they watched the Pine Ridge contingent mount their horses, "that clarifies certain matters regarding settlement relations. Territorial offices will receive appropriate documentation regarding your circumstances to prevent future complications." The practical consideration demonstrated Riversford's characteristic approach, addressing concrete needs while respecting individual autonomy. Before Ellie could express appreciation for this support, Martha emerged from the trading post with a purposeful stride that suggested developments during their absence. "Eleanor," she called, using Ellie's given name with natural familiarity that contrasted with Pine Ridge's formal distance. "The Wilkins family heard about teaching possibilities and brought their children to meet you. 3 little ones with surprising math abilities and absolute determination to learn reading properly." The simple announcement represented everything Pine Ridge lacked: organic community response based on genuine needs rather than hierarchical procedures and formal arrangements. Ellie found herself smiling with unexpected warmth as tension from confrontation dissolved before this practical reminder of meaningful purpose. "I should meet them," she responded, feeling a strange liberation in straightforward acceptance of new direction. without qualification or apology. As she walked beside Martha toward trading post entrance, Thomas stepped forward with quiet composure that suggested patience rather than intervention. His expression conveyed a complex message without words, acknowledgement of her chosen direction without presuming influence over that choice. Paths sometimes emerge from fire's destruction, he observed when she paused beside him. New growth follows different patterns than what existed before. The simple wisdom encompassed everything recent experiences had taught her, that destruction sometimes created space for renewal impossible within established patterns, that survival carried responsibility to honor lessons learned through hardship, that connections forming across supposed boundaries often proved more genuine than those enforced within artificial structures. "I believe you're right," Ellie replied with matching simplicity, "though navigating unfamiliar territory requires guides who understand multiple landscapes." Thomas's expression softened momentarily with a rare smile that transformed his typically stoic features. "Some journeys require companions rather than guides, each bringing different knowledge to a shared path." The subtle distinction carried profound implications that Ellie wasn't yet prepared to explore fully, but recognized as a significant possibility emerging from a crisis that had stripped away previous certainties while revealing unexpected strengths and connections. Inside the trading post, 3 children waited with expressions combining curiosity and evaluation. Potential students assessing potential teacher with natural directness, uncomplicated by adult social constraints. Their mother, a practical-looking woman whose calloused hands suggested hard work, while intelligent eyes revealed sharp assessment, stood nearby with hopeful expectation tempered by frontier realism. "Mrs. Wilkins," Martha began introductions. "This is Eleanor Mitchell, former schoolteacher considering Rivers Ford's education needs. My children need proper learning," Mrs. Wilkins stated without elaborate courtesy, practicality clearly valued above social niceties. "Simon reads already, but needs mathematics. Emma struggles with letters, but understands numbers naturally. Little James mainly needs patience, but shows promising curiosity." The straightforward assessment refreshed Ellie's spirit after Pine Ridge's convoluted manipulations. Here stood genuine needs, stripped of pretense or political consideration. Children requiring knowledge, parents seeking assistance, community facilitating connection between these elements without unnecessary complication. "Perhaps we could begin with informal assessment," Ellie suggested, educational instincts awakening fully. "I'd like to understand their current knowledge and learning approaches before discussing formal arrangements." As the children arranged themselves attentively at a nearby table, Ellie experienced profound certainty amid life's recent chaos. Fire had destroyed artificial structures while revealing essential foundations. Near drowning had stripped away superficial concerns while illuminating genuine priorities. Cultural boundaries had dissolved before human connections based on mutual respect rather than enforced hierarchies. Through devastation's aftermath emerged unexpected clarity, purpose defined by contribution rather than position, community built on reciprocal support rather than conformity enforcement, identity rooted in authentic expression rather than external expectations. The path forward remained unmarked by familiar signposts, but illuminated by newfound understanding that transcended previous limitations. Eleanor Mitchell, teacher and survivor, began this new chapter with a simple question to eager students. First exchange in an educational journey that would help define Rivers Ford's future while honoring wisdom gathered from multiple traditions. Outside the trading post window, Thomas Swift Arrow nodded once in acknowledgement before turning toward duties that awaited his unique capacity to navigate between worlds, separate path running parallel to hers, yet connected through shared understanding that boundaries existed primarily in human imagination rather than natural reality. The prairie would recover from fire's transformation, emerging with different patterns, yet essential continuity. Human communities could achieve similar renewal when courage permitted growth beyond established limitations. Individual lives might transform most profoundly of all when experience stripped away illusion while revealing authentic strength previously. Hidden beneath social convention, from devastating fire through desperate shelter in abandoned well to unexpected rescue and newfound purpose, Eleanor Mitchell's journey represented the possibility available to all who survived life's inevitable destructions, the opportunity to build something truer than what existed before, honoring both past foundations and future potential while remaining firmly grounded in present reality. This synthesis of multiple time frames and traditions would define Riversford's unique contribution to territorial development, with education serving as a bridge between worlds too often separated by artificial boundaries but united through shared humanity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.